Lecture 13 in Western intellectual tradition. I want today to look at the distinction between tradition with a capital T, traditions with a small t, and traditionalism. We live in a period of time when often we hear the word tradition. It's seen often by those who hear the language of people who are reactionary, people who don't want to change, movements which are frozen and embalmed in time, people who come from certain backgrounds in which their outlook, they feel it's threatened by the modern liberal mood. And so tradition is often seen in a purely negative, pejorative way, and then the language of liberty, freedom, liberalism is seen in a positive way. So when, of course, a discussion like that is framed in that manner, then inevitably the liberal notion of liberty, freedom, is seen as the good, and the language of tradition is seen as the problem. Now, of course, it should be noted at the outset that that very way of thinking in terms of liberal notions of liberty, freedom versus tradition is itself a tradition. So anyone who turns against tradition is using the language, the content, the ideology of another tradition to do so. So no one can get away from tradition. Tradition is a way of interpreting, like ideology, a way of trying to make sense of our all-too-human journey at the level of human identity, ethics, religion, theology, philosophy, economics, politics, culture, all of these large issues of the humanities themselves. So no one can get away from interpreting what they see makes for a good life. The question always is, which interpretations are more mature, more insightful, wiser, what are mediocre, what are silly, and what are hurtful and harmful for people in the long run. So initially, the point that needs to be noticed that no one can get away from tradition. Tradition is an interpretive mode by which people try and make sense of what they perceive at any given point as the better life, the good life, the more meaningful life. But there is this caricature of tradition as if a person who's liberal and concerned with freedom and liberty is against tradition, which is itself a form of tradition. So no one can escape the way of thinking, which is a tradition itself. Now, to take the next step on this journey, then, if we look at tradition in the big sense, or classical tradition, the various small t traditions within that, and then traditionalism. And so these three ways of looking at tradition are essential to understand itself. We do know, for example, in the modern world, which is a product of a tradition, the Protestant tradition, secularized Protestantism, is that we tend to favor at a deeper level the hyper-busy, the uber-active person who defines themselves by what they do, what they accomplish, how they perform, an inability to slow down, an inability to be still, a fear of silence, a fear of solitude. And so that secularized Protestantism has very, very much inhabited and taken over almost to become an imperial outlook in terms of how people understand who they are, their journey forward in life, and how they are to live. That's a tradition. So some of the modern people who think they're against tradition, they themselves are totally immersed in the tradition of the vita activa without even analyzing itself. And in fact, they're imprisoned in a tradition, a gilded cage, if one could see it as that. But that is a tradition by which modern and postmodern people come to understand themselves. And out of that springs, of course, a whole range of issues that deal with identity, politics, gender, ecological issues, race issues. But underneath all of those hot button issues in the culture wars is this vita activa tradition, which is quite different historically than the classical tradition that saw the vita contemplativa as the roots of identity and of meaning and of knowing what it means to slow down, be still. And out of that came the trunk, the branches, the leaves, the fruit of the vita activa. So that reversal of the vita contemplativa and the vita active, of which I've talked about in previous lectures, is very much a tradition that priorizes, that valorizes the vita activa and subordinates or marginalizes the vita contemplativa itself. But when we think of tradition in the big sense of the classical Western tradition, the issue then is because to understand tradition in that big T sense is to understand it's polyphonic, it's dialogical, so it's a polyphonic a dialogue between women and men grappling with some of the large issues of the good, the true, and the beautiful. So if we look at the classical tradition of, on the one hand, the clash between the tragic and the comedic, particularly the Greek tragedians like Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides. What is life at its deepest? Is it comedic? Comedic in the sense that we do have the struggles, there is the agon, there are the challenges that come our way, but to the degree we are faithful, face into the winds of time, overcoming them, the end will be happy. It will be good. Our character has been tested, it has been tried on the anvil of experience. We've come up to the challenge, the difficulties, then good will follow. That's a comedic approach to life. We find it in Dante's Divine Comedy. Walt Disney tends to focus on this type of genre of literature. There's also the tragic approach that the Greeks so well understood, and we can certainly find it in Shakespeare, Lear, Hamlet, Macbeth, many of his tragedies. He has his tragic comedies and comedic tragedies. But that's the notion that, yes, there will be the agon, there will be the struggle, there will be the challenges in life. And to the degree we come up to the challenges, the hope within the comedic version is that good will follow, the ending will be positive, but in fact within the tragic position there is no guarantee. In that sense, almost following the Sisyphus tradition. One struggles forward, one step up, but one is often beaten back by circumstances, human illnesses, war, famine, or variety of ambiguous, uncertain challenges that come our way. And so the Greek tradition, in that big sense, held together, which would be picked up by the Christian tradition also, a tension between the comedic and the tragic way of knowing. And so when we think of the big T tradition, there are these tensions that are lived within. Within the classical tradition, there is obviously the tensions between the tragedians, those who saw life more comedic, and the tensions between Plato and Aristotle. Should the state be the center from which all good emerges, and if so, who should be the leaders in the state? With Plato, a guardian class, and how does one? What is the criteria for knowing the leaders of a state, which are meant to provide justice for one and all? In Plato's case, in the polis or the city-state. Aristotle, coming a little more from what we would know as a republican tradition, surveyed various city-states in his time and looked at various possibilities, but society up, as well as the state for Aristotle, played an important role. So the big T tradition in politics, is it a statist down, or recognizing the role of society, or does one hold higher the role of society and have a somewhat lighter view of the state? These, of course, divide and are part of attention or small t traditions within the larger understanding of economics and the state within the great Western tradition itself. So just as we can have in terms of the human journey of the comedic and tragic, so when we come to the political level itself, what should be prioritized or what should be held in tension, state or society, society or the state? Those are small t traditions within the large T tradition, that internal polyphonic or many voices in dialogue interacting on the good. Out of the classical Greek tradition and certain elements of the Roman tradition emerged Christianity. And so when some people think of Christianity, they often have a very skewed or very narrow understanding of Christianity itself. The Christian tradition, capital T, has three large traditions, small t, within it. The Western Roman Catholic, the fragmentary Protestant, small t, traditions, and the Orthodox Eastern tradition. So when one speaks the word Christianity, the question that has to be asked is, what do you mean, and whose version of Christianity itself? So within the Western capital T traditions within Christianity themselves, there are three small t traditions. Now, people who grow up in some form of, say, Christianity, other religions, or what Martin Heidegger will talk about is throwiness, they often grow up in a small t tradition. It can be Roman Catholic, it can be within the Protestant traditions, the Reformed, Calvinist, it can be a Mennonite, Lutheran, Pentecostal, E-Free, Alliance. We can go on and on. But these small t traditions, now people who do not analyze what they grew up in are usually traditionalists. And so usually people, as they mature and begin to think in a minimally critical way, the danger is they absolutize their own experience, which inevitably, of course, distorts reality horrendously. It's the idolatry of experience in which people take where they have grown up in, whether it's religious or not religious, and then they just assume their experience with their family and friends defines reality in the much bigger and larger sense. If we can see tradition as a large mountain range of which there are many peaks, multiple ridges, lowlands, and people tend to grow up in a small acreage on these large mountains. Now, what we would call a tradition. Now, some of the acreages and some of the areas are much bigger on this large mountain than others, but the danger is of assuming that the acreage or the area one grows up on the large mountain is the mountain itself. And then people who don't think about their small t tradition or the small area they grow up in are usually irrational traditionalists. They just defend what they have grown up with without any meaningful reason for justifying it in comparison to other small t traditions, which are all part of a much larger capital T tradition itself. For example, to use an anthropological element within the, say, the Christian tradition, which draws inevitably from larger discussions within the classical Greek or Roman tradition or Celtic tradition. Within one wing of Christianity, when it thinks of what it means to be human, it takes the position of original sin, total depravity. People, in that sense, are incapable either of thinking the meaningful, good, true, or beautiful, or through the will. They are torn between what they know they should do, but often do not do. And so the notion that to be human is essentially fallen, it's broken, it's incapable both at the level of thought and will of leading the good life. The other wing, and so this would be elements of a certain read of St. Paul in Romans and Galatians that Augustine will pick up on. And it certainly feeds up through elements of the Roman Catholic and then dominates in the Protestant traditions of Luther and Calvin and other wings of what we call Reformed Christian thought. The other wing of Christianity, which is found contra Augustine, is the Pelagian Arminian, in which, yes, humans are imperfect, they're finite, they're fallible, but there is much good in them, and they can produce much good. They have, to use the Platonic image, there is the good, there is the dark horse, and depending on what element people choose to listen to, or the horse, as it were, of their passions or desires or longings, pulls the chariot of who they are, will determine where the chariot of their life goes and what road it tracks and the destinations it reaches. So within classical and Christian anthropology, there is this element both of the tragic, the element that humans in and of themselves are incapable of thinking and doing the good. The other element is, in fact, there's much good in humans, and they are quite capable of thinking and doing the good. And then there's the tension between both at work in humans. So the Jungian notion of the shadow, the dark side, but also the notion within the classical Christian tradition that humans are immensely capable of building civilizations, culture, hospitals, and culture and literature. And so the anthropological question in terms of the great tradition is important to reflect on as well. So we come yet once again to, we look at the big T tradition when it comes to what does it mean to be humans? What is human nature? Is there such a thing as human nature? What are the forces at work within one and all that shape, guide? Are we merely socialized and culturated? Or to what role does humans have to take responsibility for choices based on their past. And to merely use the past as an excuse not to face into the future is itself to become a victim, a double victim of the past itself. And so when we look at the big T tradition when it comes to what it means to be human, it's a polyphony, it's a dialogue, it's a discussion itself, as within larger Christianity itself. And so the West itself, largely shaped by Christianity, the big question when people raise that question, well, then whose understanding of Christianity are we talking about here? There are many small T traditions. There are people who don't think about their small T tradition, they're traditionalists, or they react to, based on upbringing, their small T tradition, which can be repressive or it can be liberating, depending on what a person has grown up in. Many people often react to hurtful, painful elements of a small T tradition within Christianity, only to reject it and thinking they're rejecting Christianity, and all they are rejecting is a painful small T tradition that had become traditionalist, and they're reacting against it. And when the human quest stops at that point, then obviously what occurs is a very shallow reaction to something much larger than a person's experience. And of course, reacting to small T tradition, inevitably a person creates their own tradition. And so when one says no to something, what is being said yes to? And if a person begins to consciously think about what they're saying yes to, rather than just intuitively responding or gut level responding and heading down a different path, that different path is a tradition. Usually it's a small T tradition in a much bigger tradition we call modern liberalism, in which people will use their own liberty as they see fit to head down the path they think gives the greatest amount of meaning. So liberalism itself is a tradition that emerges in the late Middle Ages, takes shape and form in the Reformation, as each used their liberty, all being equal in good conscience, making decisions they think in the 16th century the best for their understanding of Christianity. That led to fragmenting into multiple small T traditions, of which it was working out of a much larger T tradition itself. And as liberalism or Protestantism increasingly becomes secularized, one gets the hardline version or right wing of the Enlightenment, which turns against the sacred entirely, which they see themselves turning against tradition, but all they're doing is creating yet another tradition. And within a certain scientific, empirical, positivist tradition, that's a small T tradition within the much larger Enlightenment tradition itself. So we've looked at Charles Taylor in this course. The modern Enlightenment tradition has three wings to it, as I have discussed earlier. There's the hard scientific, rationalist, empirical tradition, and there's the romantic, intuitive, narrative, mythic reaction to that, and then there's the humanist small T tradition. So within the Enlightenment heritage, there are three traditions. The scientific tradition, which does not analyze itself, is just traditionalist, drawing from a certain wing of right-wing Enlightenment thought. The reaction to that is often romanticism, which elevates the emotions, intuitions, feelings, myth, narrative. That's a reaction to cold rationalism or cold logic or inductive or deductive thinking. That's a small T tradition responding to the right-wing small T tradition. The humanist wing, which Hegel, Taylor is coming out of it, tries to synthesize them, but that's a tradition itself. So no one can escape tradition, both in the big sense or the small T traditions or traditionalism itself. Traditionalism is always defined by an uncritical attachment to a small T tradition within the much larger big T tradition. The dilemma we face today, of course, with the emergence of certain ideas of evolution, the Darwinian tradition, the Hegelian notion that history is a movement dialectically ever forward, which is a tradition itself in terms of how history is interpreted in a progressive way, that form of tradition cancels out earlier understandings of a classical view of tradition. And so there is this clash between traditions in the capital T sense in terms of history is forward, and if history is a progressive march forward, that often drives from an optimistic view of human nature. And of course, the classical tradition always held that to be human is to live with this tension between, as I mentioned earlier, either the dark and the light horses pulling in different directions, or multiple horses, if I can use another image. Plato is that the ship is also used, in fact, by Homer in the Odyssey, is the ship of the soul, like the ship of state, has many sailors on it, which are multiple desires. And if there is no captain on the ship as it sails across the water of time and is buffeted by the winds of time and the depths of the ocean below, if there is no captain whatsoever, there's likely to be mutiny on the Bounty, and people are pulled to and fro in all sorts of directions on the ship of their soul, just as on the ship of state. So the classical heritage, when it came to understanding what it meant to be human, is there is this ongoing tension in not elevating either the optimistic or the pessimistic view of human nature. Within significant elements of liberal optimism, there's the notion that whatever a person feels, whatever they think, is de facto valid, and no one can question any subjectivity regardless of the direction it goes, without understanding that all motivations are often layered, they're thick, they're complex, and merely to indulge whatever appetite one feels at any given time without understanding it can lead to wreck and ruin of the human soul on their journey is to play into a certain optimistic view of human nature without a deeper analysis that how both motives can be mixed, as well as in thought, word, and deed, these can be mixed itself. So critical theory in terms of human desires and longings and thirsts, if they're all seen as equal, that itself is a tradition, rather than seeing certain desires are much deeper, more meaningful, more mature than others. But if a person starts from a tradition, a small t tradition, that all desires, like different sailors on a ship, are equal, then inevitably there's a huge competition within the desires of what will I heed, what will I listen to, what part of me will I indulge, what appetite will I follow, versus a hierarchy of desires in which there are good, better, best desires, and there are bad, worse, worse. And so this understanding in terms of philosophical anthropology, these are traditions. But if one starts from more the positive, then that leads in a certain direction. So to some, in many ways, and there's various directions we could follow on this, is that everyone comes from a tradition. There is a classical tradition within which there are many small t traditions. This is what we call polyphony or dialogue. And there's no such thing as, say, for example, in the classical West, it's one tradition and everyone just echoes the thinking, and it's in a hall of mirrors in that sense. So the idea that somehow tradition in a classical sense is this rational and passive approach in which there is no critical thinking. In fact, we get our modern understanding of critical thinking from the Western capital T tradition, in which there is a framework within critical thinking takes place. And so the understanding that classical tradition is authoritarian, it's irrational, there's no place for critical thinking, it's homogeneous. In fact, anyone who's minimally immersed in classical political theology or philosophy or economics will know quite clearly that, in fact, it's an ongoing internal dialogue of different voices, many phonic voices, dialogos, through thinking and reflecting, that has made the Western tradition what it is. To move forward even once, for example, into the modern tradition when it comes to economics, there are those who would argue a lighter state, the market economy, a laissez-faire. Others will argue greater state involvement, the more a person moves to the left in a Marxist direction. Society must always be subordinate to the interests of the state. The middle way is how does state and society work together for the common good. So the three economic traditions within the large T economic tradition of the West in the modern world is itself polyphonic. It engages in a dialogue on the economic issues in regards to who is responsible for what, and is the market economy the best? Is greater state interventionist the finest and fittest? And is there a middle way, a via media, that brings together the both of these? This is a tradition, small t traditions economically that stand within a much larger economic capital T tradition. So within the field of the contemplative, the active, within the area of economics, within the area of religion, I could add within the reality of culture itself and literature, of music, of the arts, huge conflicts and tensions within the Western capital T tradition itself, as there are within the modern capital T tradition, multiple small t traditions. And then traditionalism, as I mentioned earlier, is an irrational, uncritical attitude toward a small t tradition itself. And so the discussion of tradition can often not be simply and easily reduced to tradition is something of the past, in which people don't think, they just embrace what is given to them, versus liberal modernity, which is not a tradition, so it is argued, and it's about freedom. In fact, liberal modernity is its own tradition. There's no escape from tradition. When we reflect on the two courses in the history of Western intellectual thought, the question is not whether one can escape from tradition, but what tradition at its very best and wisest guides, shapes, and leads one into the more meaningful and fullest life at the level of human identity, of community. And so these are of justice, of peacemaking, all these larger themes. And this is a very large discussion. It really is very unhelpful when people slip into conservatives are about tradition and liberals are about freedom. This very much distorts a far more complex discussion, and it leads to sort of dilettantism or voyeurs who simply are lazy intellectually. And in a course, two courses on Western intellectual, political, religious thought, it really behooves one and all, if they want to move beyond fairly superficial thinking, to immerse themselves in a much more complex, layered approach to the discussion of tradition, small t traditions, and traditionalism. And each and all have to ask themselves, where do they fit in terms of how they each and all interpret who they are, how they approach the issues that are seen as significant, how they surf the trendy issues in the culture wars at the present time, and what are some of the alternate ways of looking at that, beyond turning against the past in a simplistic way and making an idol of the present in an uncritical manner.